19.
The ABC seeks to treat Indigenous cultures and beliefs with respect. To many communities, it is distressful and offensive to depict persons who have died. Indigenous communities which may be offended are warned that the following program may contain such scenes.
The Chinese dragon has been part of Bendigo's Easter Fair for more than a century. The crowd at the festival mirrors today's Australia, the result of a great remaking of the nation. Since 1945, nearly 6 million people from more than 140 countries have settled here. 100 years ago, the faces of Australia were very different. Our Federation leaders were united in a belief that Australia remain white.
The doctrine of the equality of man was never intended to apply to the equality of the Englishman and the Chinaman. Prime Minister Edmund Barton.
Unity of race is an absolute essential to the unity of Australia. Attorney General Alfred Deakin.
Our chief flag is, of course, a white Australia. There's no compromise about that. The industrious coloured brother has to go and remain away. Billy Hughes, Labor Party.
These leaders reflected a new force in Australia, a strident nationalism based on a racial vision.
All white men who come to these shores with a clean record and who leave behind them the memory of class distinctions and the religious differences of the old world are Australians. No nigger, no Chinaman, no Lascar, no Kanaka, no purveyor of cheap coloured labour is an Australian. The Bulletin, the 2nd of July, 1887.
The White Australia policy originated in the gold rushes of the 1850s. The Chinese came in their thousands. There were race riots, and by the late 19th century, the colonies had passed laws to stop coloured immigration. The first task of the new nation would be to enshrine White Australia at its heart.
White stands for Fair White Australia, while we both sing the joyous refrain, hurrah for the land of the fair and the free, always white, may it ever remain.
When you listen to our leaders 100 years ago, it's a real shock, this blatant racism. But this racist attitude was the universal view at the time. The European powers ran much of Asia and Africa in outright defiance of racial equality. Within Asian societies, racial equality was not accepted. There was a powerful logic in making White Australia the first major law of the new nation. What's remarkable is that this policy lasted for nearly 70 years. Even more remarkable, was its surrender to a dramatically different idea, a diverse and multicultural Australia.
On the 7th of August 1901, Prime Minister Barton, a political Liberal, rose to speak in the Grand Chamber of Melbourne's Parliament House. In his hands was the Immigration Restriction Bill, the White Australia Policy.
I need make no apology for calling this one of the most important matters with regard to the future of Australia.
The Parliament was convinced that a coloured class would destroy the social and political values of Australia's democracy. Virtually every MP had his say.
Mr. Speaker, can I indicate?
Barton's close colleague, Alfred Deakin, soon to be Prime Minister, offered the most powerful and enduring defence of white Australia.
The unity of Australia is nothing if that does not imply a united race. A united race not only means that its members can intermix, intermarry, and associate without degradation on either side, but implies one inspired by the same ideas.
The policy's strongest backers were in the Labor Party. Labor believed in equal rights and opposed cheap coloured labour. The caucus decided on the 20th of May 1901 that white Australia would be its #1 policy. It would be an article of faith until removed from the platform 64 years later.
The objection I have to the mixing of these coloured people with the white people of Australia, although I admit it is to a large extent tinged with considerations of an industrial nature, lies in the main in the possibility and probability of racial contamination. Chris Watson, Leader of the Labor Party.
As a means of prohibiting coloured immigrants, Barton proposed a 50-word dictation test. It was based on South Africa's Natal model. In law, such a dictation test would not discriminate by race, place, or origin. But racial exclusion would be its intent and its result.
I do not think that the doctrine of the equality of man was really ever intended to include racial equality. There is no racial equality. There is that basic inequality. These races are, in comparison with white races, unequal and inferior.
Supporting Barton was the Jewish MP Isaac Isaacs. He would later become Chief Justice of Australia's High Court and the first Australian-born Governor-General.
I am prepared to do all that is necessary to ensure that Australia shall be free for all time from the contamination and the degrading influence of inferior races.
Parliament and the people were united on the principle of a white Australia, but the politicians were divided over how to achieve it. There was a battle over Barton's dictation test. Many wanted an outright racial ban. Those supporting the ban were led by the leader of the Labor Party, Chris Watson. Watson proposed a tough amendment, a ban on all natives from Africa and Asia.
I'm convinced that the bill will not achieve its objective. It will be possible for a man to pass the examination and still be one of the most objectionable immigrants imaginable. With the Oriental, as a rule, the more he is educated, the worse man he is likely to be from our point of view.
At Government House, Melbourne, Governor-General Lord Hopetoun was keeping a watchful eye on the passage of the new bill. He cabled London.
A foreign immigration bill has been introduced, the principal bar to entry being a somewhat severe dictation test. I shall be glad to know whether royal assent should be reserved to a bill of this kind.
In London, Secretary of State for the Colonies, Joseph Chamberlain, ran an empire of coloured people. He would accept a dictation test, but he warned Australia not to impose an outright ban based on race and colour.
Any attempt is contrary to the general conceptions of equality, which have been the guiding principle of British rule throughout the empire.
Japan, Britain's key ally in Asia, was also appalled by the bill. Deeply proud of its culture, Japan campaigned against it. The Japanese ambassador in London, Baron Hayashi, accused Barton and Deakin of making
monstrous declarations. I trust that His Majesty's government will see their way to induce the federal government of Australia to dispense with the registration quite unfair to one of the friendliest nations with the United Kingdom.
Japan saw itself as racially superior to the rest of Asia. Alfred Deakin accepted Japan's superiority, but considered this a threat.
We should exclude them in the most considerate manner possible, and without conveying any idea that we have confused them with the many uneducated races of Asia and untutored savages who visit our shores.
I think Japan saw the White Australia policy as essentially an offensive, racist policy targeted against Japan. And this was a great loss of face to them diplomatically, because Japan had considered itself as a great power on the level higher than obviously Australia.
But White Australia was more important than the Empire or Japanese hostility. Many MPs were prepared to break with Britain on the issue of a racial ban. Labour MP Billy Hughes led the charge.
We want a white Australia. And are we to be denied it because we shall offend the Japanese or embarrass His Majesty's ministers? I think not.
Barton's legislation was at risk. He warned Parliament that he would not stay Prime Minister if the dictation test was overruled in favour of a direct ban. It would also mean a crisis with London.
If we imperil our relations with the Empire, or create friction which may ultimately lead to severance, let it be remembered that it is under the protection of the British fleet that we make our proposals.
On the 26th of September, 1901, the Watson Amendment was voted on.
All in favour, say aye. The contrary, no. The question resolved in the negative.
It was narrowly defeated by 5 votes. Barton prevailed. He got a White Australia policy to unite the nation and a dictation test as the device to make it work. But there was one more problem. Queensland's sugar industry had thrived for 40 years on cheap coloured labour. These South Sea Islanders, known pejoratively as Kanakas, had been forcibly removed from their homes. By 1901, nearly 9,000 islanders worked the cane fields.
The Kanaka is tropical bred for centuries. He produces a lot of work for white workers and is therefore a useful tool for a useful end. See John Rolt, Sugar Farm.
I maintain it was a form of slavery. It is true that some of the people in later years signed a contract to work for 3 years. But my father didn't, neither did his brother, and neither did their sister. They were paid nothing whatsoever.
Australia's leaders had seen the legacy of slavery in the United States. They were determined that Australia would not replicate the disastrous mistakes of America. Prime Minister Barton introduced a bill to deport the islanders back home, compensate the sugar industry, and introduce white labour on a just wage.
This government thinks that the traffic in itself is bad and must be ended. It will never be free of its inherent characteristics of slavery.
Queensland sugar interests immediately opposed the bill.
All we've asked is that black labour should be allowed to go by evolution, not by revolution. By nature's way, not by the hasty knife of a party leader hungry for votes.
Around 7,000 islanders were deported. One of them was Louis from the Burdekin area, who left a wife and son.
Dear Rosie, tell Herbert that I can't see him no more. Suppose I no see you any more along this ground, we will meet in heaven. You take Herbert with you and you take all my things, boxes, clothes, everything belong you. I sorry I no see my missus anymore. Goodbye, Rosie, and plenty of kisses. This last letter, you no more send letter to Burdekin. Your loving Louis.
Families were uprooted. Friendships were broken. It was a terrible time. It was a heartbreaking time. And they had given the country tremendous service. I'm sure that without their labour, the sugar industry would never have been developed.
After a royal commission in 1906, a number of islanders were allowed to remain. Their communities survived on the tropical east coast. With the islanders deported, governments and trade unions enforced a policy of exclusive white labour.
The sweetest story ever told. Here is the Australian version of it. I wonder if you knew that Australia is the only country in the world where cane sugar is produced and manufactured by white labour, under white men's conditions and rates of pay. Splendid specimens these of typical sun-tanned Australian manhood at its best. And the cane they cut is taller than themselves.
At the heart of the White Australia policy was the dictation test.
I am an officer of the Commonwealth Investigation Branch, Melbourne. I now propose to give you a dictation test of not less than 50 words in the English language, and you will be required to write it in that language. If you fail to pass the test, I shall declare you a prohibited immigrant.
The immigrant then had to take the dictation test.
We call the lion the king of the beasts. But compare the biggest maneless lion with a full-grown tiger.
The first official responsible for the administration of the White Australia policy was Barton's private secretary, Attlee Hunt.
Mr. Hunt, who is a gentleman of high culture, conspicuous ability, perfect zeal and great organising capacity, will be devoted to the interests of the Commonwealth.
In January 1902, in their Melbourne office, Barton and Hunt devised the first instructions on how the dictation test would be used.
It must be understood that the law does not insist that every intending immigrant should be asked. Tact and judgment will have to be exercised.
But there was a second, secret instruction. It was the key to the White Australia policy.
All Aboriginal inhabitants of Africa, Asia, and Polynesia should be subjected to the test. In the case of white races, the test will be applied only under special circumstances. If, in your opinion, the immigrant would, for reasons which you would be prepared to state, be an undesirable immigrant, it may be better to substitute for the English test a passage from some other language.
Hunt was a faithful servant for his political masters. He reported to his Prime Minister that the dictation test was ruthlessly efficient.
Dear Mr. Barton, we continue to eject the monstrous Jap and the wily Chow with persistence. The April returns show that no coloured aliens passed the test. Over 40 were rejected, mostly Chows who tried to enter Queensland on false papers.
My own mother was a good example of the White Australia policy. My family was such that although father was here before Federation, he could stay here as an alien, whereas my mother, having been born in China, every couple of years she'd come to Australia and then she'd be literally booted out and have to go back to China.
Dennis O'Hoy's family came to Australia in the 1860s. His story reflects a large-scale human tragedy. Chinese men working in Australia at Federation were allowed to stay, but their wives were denied permanent entry. A Horsham greengrocer, Poon Gui, refused to accept separation from his wife. In 1913, Poon Gui, his wife and 2 Australian-born children were forcibly deported.
It is finished. I go. I've been so long away from China that I cannot say what I shall do. I find it pretty hard. I had to sacrifice my business to go home with my wife. I like Australia, but I do not like the way the government has treated me. 12th of May, 1913.
It was heartbreaking that these people, and I've got a shed full of photographs of them, that these people could never see their wives or their families, and they were separated for 30, 40 years, and a lot of them actually just died here.
By World War I, white Australia was a way of life and would be defended to the last man.
We are fighting to defend the White Australia policy where alone it can be defended, on the battlefields of Europe. Then, and only then, will White Australia be secure. The Sydney Mail, 25th of October, 1916.
During the war, Australia had a new Prime Minister, Billy Hughes. Hughes believed that victory in the Great War would guarantee the White Australia policy. But the war had a great consequence. It made White Australia an international issue. The showdown came at the 1919 Paris Peace Conference. When world leaders gathered to create a new order, Billy Hughes revelled in the spotlight.
We are here in this ancient and most wonderful city of Paris. A motley band of highbrows, more or less highbrow, gathered together for the amiable purpose of settling the peace of the world.
Billy Hughes came to Paris to defy the world. He was the centre of a major row involving Britain's Prime Minister Lloyd George and US President Woodrow Wilson.
William Morris Hughes was the stormy petrel of the British delegation. He almost caused the collapse of the conference. He's a natural-born fighter, all grit and gunpowder. Patrick Gallagher, author.
Japan was the dominant power in Asia and a British ally. The Japanese went to Paris to have a racial equality clause inserted in the new League of Nations Charter.
This was a tremendously important issue in Japan at the time, and there were public meetings on the racial equality proposal, and the Japanese saw this as the most important demand that the Japanese government could make at the Paris Peace Conference.
In meetings at the Hotel de Crillon, Hughes fought Japan's position with a stubborn tenacity. He would tolerate no weakening of white Australia. The Japanese got nowhere with him.
Hughes alone persisted along his stubborn, solitary path. The other prime ministers were free to do as they liked. He would do what his duty demanded. So saying, he left the meeting. Japanese delegation, 30th of March, 1919.
Britain's Lloyd George was also the target of Hughes' extravagant threats.
Morning, noon, and night he bellows at poor Lloyd George that if race equality is recognized in the preamble or any of the articles in the covenant, he and his people will leave the conference bag and baggage. Colonel Bunsen, United States delegation.
In a tension-filled final meeting chaired by Woodrow Wilson, Japan demanded a vote. 11 of the 17 nations voted in favor of the racial equality provision. But President Wilson declared the vote lost because it was not unanimous. Hughes had won. He had killed the racial equality proposal. He returned to Australia triumphant.
The white Australia is yours. You may do with it what you please, but at any rate, the soldiers have achieved the victory, and my colleagues and I have brought that great principle back to you from the conference as safe as it was on the day when it was first adopted.
There was a lone voice prepared to challenge Hughes and his hysterics in Paris. Australia's Director of Military Intelligence, Major Edmund Pease, saw the dangers.
Mr. Hughes has chosen to emphasize the national distinction between the Japanese and ourselves in a way that could not fail to be offensive to a high-spirited people. Their effect in Japan has been most serious. Improvement in our relations has been destroyed by a few sentences from Mr. Hughes.
In the long run, I think it did have a negative effect on Japan's relations with Australia. And not only that, it discredited the Anglo-Saxon powers, because the Anglo-Saxon powers were always harping on about having a fair and just international order. And from the Japanese perspective, they could say, what sort of fair and just order is it if it doesn't even accept racial equality of peoples?
For the next 2 decades, the face of Australia would be overwhelmingly of British-Irish heritage. Australia's population by the end of the 1930s was only 7 million. It was a nation of innocents, unaware of the looming threat. World War II was the turning point for Australian society. Australia was threatened with invasion by Japan. Darwin was bombed. National survival was at risk. Labour's war leaders, John Curtin and Ben Chifley, embarked on a bold new plan of post-war reconstruction. When Chifley became Prime Minister, he launched a population expansion programme. Populate or perish was its slogan.
White Australia was our first faith, but the war would create a second faith. This was the conviction that Australia had to develop in order to survive. That meant bringing millions of new settlers to start a new life. It became a great immigration program, and it had a consequence its architects never intended. It would eventually destroy white Australia.
Chifley appointed a new Minister for Immigration, Arthur Calwell. He was a passionate champion of a bigger Australia.
And many others. We are but 7 million people. We hold 3 million square miles of this Earth's surface. Third World War is not impossible. We may have only those next 25 years in which to make the best possible use of our second chance to survive. Our first requirement is additional population.
The programme was social engineering on a massive scale. The aim was to increase Australia's population by 70,000 a year. But Calwell promised that migrants would only come as long as jobs were available.
It was an act of political courage on the part of Arthur Calwell to get the union movement to accept a large-scale migration program from Europe. It was visionary because it had some idea of a larger, better, more effective Australia.
When the first post-war migrants started to arrive, Australians were suspicious.
Most of the press echoed the warning that the high standard of Australian living was endangered by importing immigrants indiscriminately. Minister of Information and Immigration, Mr. Calwell, has been the target for strong press criticism in this immigration venture.
Calwell's aim was to buttress white Australia, not to weaken it. He initially wanted 9 out of 10 migrants to be British, with the rest coming from Northern Europe. But there was a problem.
Thousands of British men and women visit Australia House each week to learn more about our country.
There were no ships to bring British migrants to Australia, so Calwell was forced to take drastic action.
If we have no ships, we shall get no immigrants. And without immigration, the future of the Australia we know will be both uneasy and brief. As a nation, we shall not survive.
Calwell climbed aboard the flying boat at Rose Bay for his mission. His secret destination was the displaced persons camps of Europe. 8 million people were now homeless. Reached an agreement to accept displaced persons. At the signing ceremony, he declared,
"Our policy has no race prejudice."
But Calwell's real agenda was revealed in his report.
Australia would be interested in the more youthful types of Baltic peoples who were capable of doing hard work, of good character and a clean record. We preferred the horny hand of the sons of toil.
We were given instructions that on the first ship or ships, we were only to select people from the Baltic states. That's Latvia, Estonia and Lithuania. They were to be, in the main, unskilled workers because whatever their qualifications were, they were not going to be recognised in Australia. So we were very, very concerned to make a good impression on the Australian population as to the types of people that were coming.
The first boatload of displaced persons arrived in Melbourne in December 1947. As a type, they were blonde and blue-eyed, just what Arthur Caldwell wanted.
Are anxious to stake their future.
Displaced persons had to work for 2 years in jobs solely at the government's discretion. While British migrants were preferred, a majority of arrivals in the first 3 years were displaced Europeans. The British monopoly had been broken in the cause of a bigger population.
There is nothing more important in the history of Australia than the immigration program. There has, in my judgment, never been any other country which in such a short time has so peaceably and constructively changed its composition. And this in a way which has been both economically enormously beneficial and also in the sense of enriching us culturally and in so many other ways.
But Caldwell was also implementing an old Australian policy, sending Asians back home. During the war, around 5,000 Asians were given temporary sanctuary in Australia. Many assisted in the war effort. Most were then repatriated, but a small number fought to remain. One of them was an Indonesian widow with 7 children who had remarried in Australia. Mrs. Annie Miles O'Keefe went to the High Court and won the right to stay. Caldwell reacted immediately. He passed a punitive new law to deport Asians.
Mrs. O'Keefe and her children are not important. It is the precedent that's important. We can have a white Australia, we can have a black Australia, but a mongrel Australia is impossible. And I shall not take the first steps to establish the precedents which will allow the floodgates to be opened.
Caldwell was bringing in new migrants from Europe, welcoming them with open arms, give them free passage and providing them with accommodation on one hand. On the other, people who worked during the wartime, out you go. And that's what we call racism.
Within days of the passage of the Wartime Refugee Removal Act, Caldwell moved to deport around 300 Asians. Jimmy Han was threatened with deportation. He had just married Norma.
You couldn't make plans. Your whole life was taken up with the fear of deportation. Australia was my home, and it had become Jimmy's home. He had no home to go home to in Singapore or China. But it was my home, definitely, and I didn't want to have people like Arthur Caldwell putting me out.
Arthur Caldwell succeeded in deporting most of the Asians, but this time he went too far.
All eyes turn to the national capital at Canberra. Newly elected Prime Minister Menzies arrives with his wife and daughter Heather.
When Robert Menzies won the 1949 election, he allowed a number of Asians, including Jimmy Han, to remain. Menzies' aim was to ensure that the White Australia policy was respectable. Menzies was Prime Minister for 17 years, and during this time, 2.5 million migrants arrived. He kept and expanded Caldwell's program. Despite his British credentials, fewer than half these migrants came from Britain. Italians, Greeks, Dutch, Yugoslavs and Poles arrived in their thousands. But they came on one condition. they had to assimilate with Australians.
Having renounced allegiance to your former country and having taken the oath of allegiance, you are now as truly British as any who have been born on this soil of Australian parents.
But immigration was changing Australia. By the 1960s, white Australia was being debated in clubs and pubs and on the streets.
The minute you let them in, you're going to finish up. You'll get overrun with them.
When they get into a white country, then they want to intermarry, and I don't think it's fair on the children.
I think we should take the Asians in. I don't think we can expect to keep Australia white forever.
Well, I think that they should keep it white as much as possible. We're all supposed to be brothers and sisters, aren't we?
It's really our country. Just keep them out.
Keep them out. Keep all the niggers out. Japs and everybody else. Well, we don't want them.
We are in total breach of a moral principle if we exclude people on the grounds of race or colour.
But there was a quiet revolution taking place on university campuses. Here, there were thousands of Asian students studying under the Colombo Plan initiative of the Menzies government.
Actually, it's based on racial prejudice.
I think everybody are human being and human being are all alike.
I think it's just plain unfair that people should be discriminated against just because of their skin colour. I mean, it's immoral. It gets Australia very bad publicity in the eyes of the world.
A campaign against white Australia was launched by staff and students. Church, Labour and Liberal groups branded the policy immoral.
It was a moral issue to the extent that many of us had Asian friends and they couldn't come into Australia. And, you know, we were passionate about this. For us, it was an ancient mariner's albatross around the neck, and we had to get rid of it. And one of our arguments in the immigration reform group was we have to make a very clear break and some sort of symbolic act to indicate that the White Australia policy is dead.
Asian nations had won their independence. Australia was entering into new economic and military ties in the region. It had no choice but to open its doors to its nearest neighbours.
It made Australia look exclusionist, afraid of contact with Asians and others not white, willing to take migrants from Malta, Turkey, but not from Asia. You took farmers from Southern Europe, but not thinkers from Asia.
There are mean things happening in this land.
White Australia became a battle between generations.
Make their stand. Want to keep the budget right. Want to keep Australia white. Oh, there's me.
Both Prime Minister Menzies and now Labour leader Arthur Calwell were under attack as upholders of the old order.
I was profoundly embarrassed by it, and I did all I could to change it. And you remember, it was changed within 5 years of my becoming deputy leader of the party, because it was impossible for a democratic socialist party like ours to enshrine a racial test. And moreover, we were promoting migration as long as people were white.
The Labour Party finally voted to delete White Australia from its platform at its 1965 conference.
Put the resolution. All in favour say aye. Aye. Against? It's carried. Delegates will proceed to the next item of business.
There was a similar struggle inside the Menzies government. The champion for reform was Immigration Minister and former world champion cyclist Hubert Opperman. In September 1964, Opperman tried to change the policy, but Menzies was opposed.
The Cabinet felt that the proposal put forward could not do other, if approved, than give the impression of significant relaxation and reduction of Australia's immigration policy. The Cabinet made it clear that it was not prepared to approve or permit such a result.
Asian resentments only multiplied, especially when a university-educated Filipino banker, Aurelio Locsin, was refused entry.
I felt that since I speak English, and I've been educated in the Western tradition, I saw no reason at all why I couldn't be assimilated to the population.
What do you think yourself, in your own mind, is the reason for the rejection of your application?
I don't look enough like a white man.
In January 1966, Menzies retired and was replaced by Harold Holt. Holt championed Australia's relations with Asia. He knew the policy must change.
He did have a different attitude to some of these things. Recognition that the world was changing, that policies discriminatory on the basis of race or ethnicity or colour were increasingly being condemned around the world. What was happening in South Africa? All of these things were elements which persuaded people that the policy needed to change, had to change.
Holt wanted to stop Asian criticism, but he did not want a big increase in coloured immigration. A cautious cabinet voted for change, that non-Europeans be allowed to enter, but in limited numbers.
When the 1966 decision was taken on the basis of Opperman's submission, I'd be quite certain that the Cabinet did not have in mind that it was making great changes in the migration program, or that it wanted to look forward to a vast change in the composition of the Australian community.
The White Australia policy was abolished gradually and by stealth. Its abolition was less honest than its creation 65 years earlier. The Holt Cabinet took the major decision, and the issue was never put before the people. This was really a question of national survival. The policy had to be abolished if Australia was to engage with Asia on a basis of mutual respect.
It was the Labour government of Gough Whitlam, elected in 1972, which finalised the abolition of White Australia and went one step further. It publicised around the world Australia's new non-discriminatory policy.
In 1973, when the last vestiges of the White Australia policy were swept away, of course that brought a reaction. They were upset. They couldn't believe it. It took them a while to digest the fact that Australia, for the first time in 200 years, had wiped its face clean of racism as far as the statute books were concerned.
I think White Australia was a far greater inhibition to us than it ever was to anyone that had to deal with it from outside. And the interesting thing is that we came close to being marginalised the way South Africa was marginalised with apartheid. We got out of it just in the nick of time.
By the 70s, the policy was dead, but Australia was still predominantly white. Events in Asia would soon change this. The communist triumph in Vietnam in 1975 soon saw boatloads of Vietnamese refugees sailing south.
If it was up to you now, which country would you head for?
I think all of us in the boat now want to go to Australia.
Well, the dominant feeling was that we had to give these people a home, especially people who had been associated with either the Australian Embassy or the Australian Armed Forces in Vietnam. Our presence there had encouraged them to fight. So I think we had a commitment, an obligation to such people, and we fulfilled that obligation.
It was a crisis for the Southeast Asian region. Refugee resettlement agreements were negotiated, and the Fraser government took large numbers of Indo-Chinese. This became the most substantial entry of Asians into Australia since the Chinese in the 19th century. Nearly 200,000 Indo-Chinese settled here, refugees and their reunited families, in the 20 years after 1975.
We had to establish a rational program for processing people, and per capita we took more than the United States. There was a total bipartisanship because there was no doubt in the minds of any of the parliamentarians that I had dealings with about the importance of this policy for Australia, and it was quite a genuine bipartisan one.
From this time, at least a third of the annual immigration intake has been Asian. The refugee crisis signaled the birth of a new multiracial Australia.
We have only been multiracial in a process which started in the 1960s and was cemented in the 1980s. We changed our definition then of what it was to be an Australian. Up to that point of time, the starting point of the definition of Australian had been the word white.
It might have been the most important thing that my government accomplished, because whatever anyone might have said since, the fact that we then accepted a multicultural Australia and accepted that, you know, people didn't have to forget their land of origin or forget their affection for it to be a good Australian, was enormously important in building a cohesive society.
Multiculturalism became the new official faith. It was an ambitious idea, designed to manage diversity and unity together.
We wouldn't have been as economically strong as we were, we wouldn't have been as culturally diverse and enriched by definition if these people hadn't come to make Australia their home. So I had this feeling that Australia was just changing for the better.
75 years after Federation, exclusion and assimilation were now replaced by inclusion and multiculturalism. But in the 1990s, a voice from the past emerged, attacking Australia's new diversity.
I and most Australians want our immigration policy radically reviewed and that of multiculturalism abolished. I believe we are in danger of being swamped by Asians. Arthur Calwell was a great Australian and Labor leader, and it is a pity that there are not men of his stature sitting on the opposition benches today.
There was an outcry.
And together we will bring equality to all Australians.
Pauline Hanson won her seat as an independent. She echoed the old Australia of racism and assimilation.
Looks like in 50 or 100 years' time. What is
Prime Minister John Howard saw Hansonism as primarily a backlash against social and economic change.
Hansonism was a cry from people who felt that they were missing out economically. Along the way, Hansonism acquired these sort of anti-Asian, anti-migrant overtones as a more a device rather than a reality. Most of the people who were attracted to Hanson were no more racist than you or I.
I believe that Pauline Hanson was a danger to many of the values that Australia had come to represent in a very full and open way. But if I had been dealing with it, I would have said something about her policies from the moment they started to come up above the horizon.
Despite One Nation strong vote, Pauline Hanson appears to have failed in her bid to win the Queensland seat of Blair.
Disappointed? Very disappointed, yes I am.
Despite Hanson, there is no turning back. For many Australians, multiculturalism is a way of life. But immigration and multiculturalism remain contentious.
There is a tolerance meter which swings about in different parts of the country and at different points of time. But the level of tolerance that Australians have for each other is probably greater than just about any other nation on earth.
The key to Australia's 20th century transformation was opening its doors to new arrivals. It has been an audacious exercise in nation building, as impressive as any nation on earth. Nearly a quarter of today's community was born overseas. White Australia has been replaced by a culturally diverse Australia.
Australia is a country that has largely reinvented itself. This is our greatest achievement as a nation. Our story tells us how powerful white Australia was and how long it lasted. But after its abolition, Australians embraced the values of multiculturalism and diversity with remarkable success and speed. Differences still remain, however, over how Australians relate to one another and to the world. Our great adaptation to Asia has just begun, and it will be a constantly unfolding story.
In a moment, a look at 100 years for next week. And if you're on the net, you can now discuss the issues from tonight's program with Paul Kelly and other participants by visiting the website via ABC Online. Just go to abc.net.au/100 years.
Hello, I'm Jennifer Byrne. Stay with us now as foreign correspondent investigates the invasion of the tomb raiders in Cambodia, with life threatening to imitate art. And assault on a saint, criticism of Mother Teresa's legacy following claims of neglect and abuse among Calcutta's poor. That's foreign correspondent coming up in just a moment.